The prairie town of Dry Creek was a place where people talked too much and listened too little, a place where every scar, every rumor, and every broken dream lingered longer than the wind. Amid the noise of gossip and the clatter of wagon wheels stood Clara Holla, a woman who moved through the world like a ghost, present yet unseen once. Clara had been the pride of the little town, the girl with the kind smile and a laugh that made men tip their hats and women sigh with envy. But that was before the fire, the blaze had taken her family, her home, and what she believed to be her beauty. When the smoke cleared, Clara was left with scars tracing down one side of her face, a reminder of everything she had lost now, years later. She worked quietly behind the counter of the town's general store. Her days were predictable, arranging goods on shelves, counting coins into a worn till, and keeping her eyes low when customers entered. She wore a light scarf that covered the lower half of her face, not out of vanity, but out of shame and habit. Children sometimes stared, tugging at their mothers' skirts to ask questions. The mothers would hush them quickly and offer Clara pitying smiles she couldn't stand to return every morning. Clara told herself the same thing. You're safe if you stay small. If she kept to her work, avoided mirrors, and spoke little, the world might forget to hurt her again. But the world has a way of stirring when it senses stillness. It was late afternoon when Wyatt Callan first rode into Dry Creek, a stranger draped in dust, his horse as tired as the man himself. He wasn't a talker, and when he entered the store, the usual chatter dimmed. The other customers watched curiously as the tall cowboy removed his hat, revealing eyes the color of the storm about to break outside. Clara didn't look up right away. She was used to drifters coming through, men who bought tobacco, whiskey, or bullets before riding back to whatever lonely horizon awaited them. But when Wyatt spoke, his voice was different, low, steady, and kind, like someone who'd spent too many years talking to the wind. "Ma'am," he said softly, setting down a few coins, "I'm looking for supplies, coffee, flour, and rope, if you've got it." Clara nodded, her movements precise, her words few. She gathered the items without ever meeting his gaze. When their hands brushed as she handed him the rope, she froze. Wyatt didn't flinch, didn't stare. He simply nodded his thanks, as if he hadn't noticed the faint burn marks along her wrist or the shadows hiding beneath her scarf. That simple, quiet decency unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. As Wyatt turned to leave, a gust of wind blew through the open door, catching her scarf and tugging it aside for a moment. One terrible, eternal moment. Her scars were bare to the world. Clara's breath caught in panic, expecting the look she'd grown to dread, pity, horror, or disgust. But Wyatt didn't look away. He didn't even blink. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly, as though he saw something familiar in her pain. "Ma'am," he said again, his tone gentle but firm, "you don't have to hide from me." Then he tipped his hat and stepped out into the gathering dusk that night. Long after she'd locked the store and drawn the curtains, Clara found herself thinking about the stranger with the storm-colored eyes, the man who hadn't looked at her like she was broken for the first time in years. She felt something stir inside her chest, a faint warmth beneath all the numbness. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something quieter, something rarer. It was being seen. Wyatt Callan was a man shaped by the silence of the plains, a man who spoke little because the past had already said too much to most folks. He was just another drifter passing through Dry Creek, a ranch hand between jobs, or a quiet loner chasing the horizon. But behind those calm, steady eyes was a history carved deep, a trail of loss, betrayal, and lessons learned too late years ago. Wyatt had believed in things like love, beauty, and promises. He once owned a small spread in Abilene, built with his own hands and shared with a woman who could light up a room with a smile. Her name was Annie, and for a while, she was his whole world. But the same charm that had drawn him to her had also drawn others, wealthier men, Smoother talkers, men who offered silken wine instead of dust and sweat. When Annie left him, she didn't just take his savings. She took his trust in anything pretty or easy from that day forward. Wyatt swore he'd never fall for pretty again. Not the kind you could see, anyway. Pretty faces, he'd decided. Hid the ugliest truth since then. He'd ridden alone, trading work for shelter and companionship for peace. He wasn't cruel or bitter, just tired. The kind of tired that settles in a man's bones and never quite leaves. When he rode into Dry Creek that cold autumn day, he wasn't looking for company. He was looking for distance. Distance from memories, from people. From the ache of being known. The land was enough for him now. The sound of a horse's hooves, the whisper of wind through the grass, the quiet rhythm of living simply. But then he met Clara Hawley, the woman behind the counter with the soft voice and downcast eyes. There was something about her, not the way she looked, but the way she didn't try. No false smiles, no fluttering lashes, no game. She spoke as if words cost her something, and maybe they did. The more he saw her, the more he noticed what others missed, the way she wrapped her scarf, not to look mysterious, but to disappear. The way her hands trembled slightly when she passed change to a stranger. The way she stood, ready to retreat at the slightest sound of judgment. Wyatt knew that stance. He'd lived it. Came back to the general store the next day. Not because he needed more supplies, but because something in him felt drawn there. A quiet curiosity he couldn't explain. When Clara saw him, she looked surprised, maybe even uneasy. He noticed how she stiffened, how her fingers brushed the edge of her scarf. "I forgot the matches yesterday," he said simply. Though he hadn't nodded, reaching for the shelf. "That'll be 5 cents. Mister," as she handed him the small box. Their fingers brushed again this time. She didn't pull away quite as fast. Wyatt caught her gaze, just for a heartbeat, and in that instant he saw not fear, but weariness, the kind that comes from carrying your shame too long. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he'd known women far more beautiful but none half as real. But Wyatt was a man of few words, and what he didn't say spoke louder than what he could. "Don't let them tell you who you are," he said quietly before turning to leave. Clara froze. It was such a simple sentence, but to her it sounded like forgiveness that evening. Wyatt rode out to the ridge beyond town. The dying sun setting fire to the horizon. He thought of her again. The way her voice trembled when she spoke. The sadness in her eyes that matched his own. He spent years avoiding pretty faces because they reminded him of lies. But Clara's face, scarred, uncertain and honest, reminded him of something truer. Not all broken things stay broken, and maybe, just maybe, this time he wasn't meant to ride away. The evening Clara Hawley met Wyatt Callan for the second time. The wind carried the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The small town of Dry Creek had long gone quiet. Lanterns glowed faintly behind curtained windows, and the only sounds were the soft clatter of a swinging saloon door and the steady hum of crickets in the sagebrush. Clara stood alone in the small general store. Closing up for the night, she moved with care, stacking crates, sweeping the floor, the kind of slow rhythm people keep when they don't want to think too hard. The store wasn't just her job. It was her refuge within these wooden walls. She could almost forget the whispers that followed her name, the way people looked twice at the faint scar tracing her jaw, the one she always tried to hide beneath her scarf, just as she was reaching for the lantern to snuff it out. The door creaked open. Wyatt stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "Didn't mean to startle you." Clara startled anyway. Her hand tightened around the lantern's handle. "We're closed," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Wyatt set his hat on the counter, saw the light on. "Thought you might still be here." She hesitated. He wasn't like most men who came through. There was no leer, no easy grin, no attempt to charm her into comfort, just a steady calm. a presence that filled the room without forcing it. "What did you need?" she asked, still wary he met her eyes. "Just some company." "I guess." The words hung between them. Fragile as glass, Clara didn't know what to say. No one had ever come seeking her company, only her labor, her silence, or her distance. She set down the broom. "I don't have much to offer," she said. "Maybe that's why I'm here," Wyatt replied. A hint of a smile ghosting across his face, they stood there for a long moment before she motioned toward the small pot of coffee simmering on the stove. He accepted the invitation without words. Sitting at the small wooden table near the window, the lantern's glow flickered over his features, the sharp lines of a man who'd weathered too many storms. The quiet depth in his eyes. Clara poured 2 cups, her hands trembling slightly as she sat across from him. For a time, they simply sat in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't awkward but safe. Then, softly, Wyatt spoke. "You said something earlier about not being pretty." Clara froze, her cheeks flushed. "I shouldn't have said that." "Why not?" "Because it's true," she whispered. "And saying it out loud makes it sound like I'm fishing for pity. She hesitated, her voice breaking. "I know what people see when they look at me. I've stopped trying to pretend otherwise." Wyatt leaned back in his chair, studying her quietly. "You think pretty's what makes a woman worth something?" Her eyes met his, glistening. "It sure seems to be what the world cares about." He nodded slowly, staring into his cup. "Maybe, but I've seen a lot of pretty things turn ugly when life got hard. Paint washes off, words twist, hearts break easy. I've had enough of pretty lies to last me 2 lifetimes." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his eyes that mirrored her own hurt. "What happened to you?" she asked. He chuckled dryly. "Same thing that happens to anyone who trusts too easy. I believed someone who made love sound simple. Turns out it ain't." Silence filled the room again, but this time it was heavier, not empty, but full of unspoken understanding. "I used to think love was for beautiful people," Clara murmured, tracing the rim of her cup, "people with perfect smiles and perfect lives. But now—" she hesitated, searching for the words. "I just want someone who doesn't flinch when they see me." Wyatt's voice softened. "Then maybe you've been looking in the wrong direction." "Miss Hawley." Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say. But she didn't need to. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her scars, not for her silence, but for her truth outside. Snow began to fall in slow, gentle flakes, covering the dusty streets of Dry Creek and a soft white hush inside. 2 lonely souls sat across from each other, the flicker of lantern light binding them in a fragile, wordless understanding. They were both broken in their own ways. But maybe, just maybe, they'd found someone who knew how to hold broken things. Gently, the peace Clara and Wyatt had begun to build was delicate, a fragile truce between 2 hearts scarred by life's harsh lessons. But in a town like Dry Creek, peace rarely lasted long. Words had a way of twisting, whispers had a way of growing teeth, and small minds found cruel delight in the misfortunes of others. For weeks, Clara had allowed herself to believe things were changing. Wyatt came by the store often, fixing shelves, bringing fresh firewood, sharing quiet meals that stretched into long conversations. His presence had become her comfort, not loud or dramatic, but steady, like a sunrise she could depend on. The townsfolk noticed. Of course, at first, they only looked, then they began to talk. It started with small, stinging remarks. A pair of women by the well, whispering as Clara passed, a widow living alone. And now the ranchers spending every evening there. One murmured, "It ain't decent." Another voice chimed in, lower but sharper, "She's always been desperate. Guess she found a new way to fill her table." Clara kept her head down, clutching her basket, pretending she didn't hear, but she did. Every word, each one was like a pebble thrown against glass, not enough to shatter, but enough to weaken by the week's end. The gossip had become wildfire in the saloon. Men laughed about Callan's charity work in the mercantile. Women exchanged looks when Clara entered, their smiles tightening, their chatter stopping mid-sentence. Even children began to repeat what they heard at home when Wyatt walked into town. The whispers followed him too. He felt them, the weight of disapproval, the judgment of people who'd never known what loneliness could drive a person to. But unlike Clara, he didn't bow under it. He faced it head on. With that same quiet steel that had carried him through years of ranch work and loss. One afternoon, he found Clara behind the store, her face pale, her eyes wet with unshed tears. She was sitting on an overturned crate, hands clenched in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. "They're talking, aren't they?" she asked before he could speak. Wyatt sighed and leaned against the wall beside her. "They always do. Clara, talkin's easier than understandin'." Her voice trembled. "They're saying I've trapped you, that I'm shameful. I've worked so hard to stay quiet, to stay decent, and now—" She broke off, her voice cracking. "It's like everything I've rebuilt is being torn apart again." Wyatt crouched down so their eyes met. "You've done nothing wrong, you hear me? Folks around here just can't stand to see someone finding peace when they've got none of their own." "But it hurts," she whispered. "I can take being alone, I've done it for years, but being called a woman without shame, it feels like being burned alive." He wanted to protect her, to silence every cruel mouth in Dry Creek. But he knew that was a battle he couldn't win with fists or fury. So instead, he spoke softly, the way you speak to something fragile but strong. "Let him talk. I'll be right here. You don't owe anyone your silence or your shame." Still, the gossip took its toll. Business at the store slowed. Women stopped visiting. Even the pastor's wife turned her face away during Sunday service. Wyatt's visits became fewer, not because he wanted distance, but because he saw how the stairs hurt her. One cold evening, Clara finally said it aloud, the fear that had been eating at her. "Maybe you should stop coming for your own sake." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "You think I care what they say?" "I think you should," she whispered, "because I can survive their cruelty. I've done it before, but I couldn't stand to see it aimed at you for a long time." He said nothing then. With quiet conviction, he answered, "I've lived most of my life alone, Clara, but the only time I felt any peace was sitting across from you. If that makes me a fool in their eyes, so be it." Tears welled in her eyes. "They'll never stop." "Wyatt," he nodded slowly, "then let 'em wear themselves out. The truth don't bend just because folks can't see it." As he left that night, the moon hung cold and white over Dry Creek, and Clara watched him disappear into the snow. Her heart ached, not from shame, but from the dawning realization that love, real love, was never easy. The town's cruel tongues could wound, yes, but they couldn't touch the quiet strength that had begun to bloom between two souls who refused to let bitterness win. They didn't know it yet, but their defiance, gentle, steadfast, and pure, would soon be the thing that changed everything. Winter had tightened its grip on Dry Creek, turning the land white and silent, but inside Wyatt Callan's heart, something steady and alive had taken root, something even the cold couldn't kill. The whispers had not stopped, but he had grown used to them. They were just noise. What mattered was what he saw when he looked at Clara. Not the shame others cast upon her, but the quiet courage of a woman who refused to let life break her twice. But Clara wasn't as strong as she pretended. The gossip had taken its toll. She'd stopped attending Sunday service, stopped walking to the market unless she had to, and spoke less. Each time Wyatt came by, she'd smile. Of course, she always smiled, but her eyes told another story, one of exhaustion and doubt. Then came the night that proved everything. A blizzard hit Dry Creek without warning, the kind that swallowed the horizon and howled through every crack in the wood. Wyatt was miles away at his ranch when he noticed the storm building. Dark clouds rolling low and fast, he thought of Clara, her little store, her flickering lamp. Her and the small fire she depended on to keep warm. Something deep in him stirred. An instinct stronger than logic, without hesitation. He saddled his horse and rode into the storm. By the time he reached town, snow was knee-deep, and the wind cut like a knife. He could barely see ahead. But he knew every turn, every fence post, every shadow. When he reached the store, the door was stuck half open. Snow already piling inside his heart dropped. Clara. He shouted, pushing his way through inside. The lamp had gone out, the fire was cold, and in the back room, wrapped in a blanket and shivering, was Clara. She had collapsed beside the hearth, her hands clutching an old shawl, the one her mother had given her before she died. Wyatt knelt beside her, fear tightening in his chest. Clara, can you hear me? Her lips moved, barely. Didn't think the storm would be this bad. He gathered her in his arms, pulling her close. You're coming with me, she weakly protested. You'll freeze out there. He silenced her with a look. Then we'll freeze together. But I'm not leaving you here. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her gently, and carried her to his horse. The ride back was brutal, snow blinding, wind howling, but he kept her safe in his arms, shielding her body with his own. Every mile was a battle. But he didn't stop, not once. By the time they reached his cabin, the storm was a white wall. He brought her inside, set her by the fire, and worked through the night to bring her warmth back, rubbing her hands, wrapping her in blankets, feeding her spoonfuls of broth once she could swallow. When she finally woke, dawn had begun to break, a soft golden light spilling through the window. Wyatt sat nearby, half asleep in the chair, snow still melting in his hair. You shouldn't have come, she whispered weakly. He opened his eyes, met hers, and smiled faintly. And leave you to die alone? Not a chance. Tears filled her eyes. Why would you risk your life for me? Wyatt leaned forward, voice rough but full of truth. Because love ain't about saying the right words, Clara. It's about showing up when no one else will. Her breath caught. You love me? He nodded once, quietly. Reckon I have for a while now. Didn't mean to just happened. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and took his hand. Then I'll try not to be afraid anymore. Outside, the storm was dying, but inside the cabin, something stronger was being born. A love proven not by pretty words or promises, but by action, by sacrifice, by the simple, unwavering truth of a man who chose to stay. When the townsfolk later heard how Wyatt had braved the storm, some called it foolish, others called it noble, but Clara didn't care what they said anymore, because for the first time in years, she understood what it felt like to be safe, not just from the cold, but from loneliness itself. And Wyatt Callan, the silent cowboy who had once sworn never to love again, had proven that the truest kind of love doesn't need to be spoken, it only needs to be lived. Spring came slowly to Dry Creek that year, as if the land itself needed time to thaw after so long under frost. Snowmold turned the stream silver. The prairie bloomed in soft greens, and the wind carried the scent of life returning in the middle of that quiet rebirth. A story had begun to spread, not of scandal, not of shame, but of love. Wyatt Callan and Clara Hawley had weathered both storm and rumor, and they had come out stronger. The townsfolk, who once whispered behind Clara's back, now looked at her with a kind of reluctant respect. They'd seen the cowboy ride through a blizzard to save her life. They'd seen him rebuild her store's roof when it caved in under the snow, and most of all, they'd seen the way he looked at her, steady, unashamed, and full of something truer than the shallow flattery of most men. But Wyatt and Clara weren't thinking about what others saw. They were busy living each morning. He'd help her open the store, fix the shelves, or chop wood for the stove. She'd make coffee strong enough to wake a corpse and tease him that he never smiled enough. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he'd catch her humming softly, something he hadn't heard from her before. It wasn't a tune of sorrow, but of peace. Yet deep down, Clara still battled the ghost of her old fears. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, she broke the silence. "Wyatt, do you ever wish you'd found someone different? Someone without all this?" She gestured to the faint scar on her cheek, the reminder of a life she'd tried to bury. He turned to her, brow furrowed. "Different? You mean someone who ain't honest?" She blinked, surprised. "Honest?" "Yeah," he said simply, leaning back. "All my life I've known people who painted themselves up real nice, said the right things, smiled at the right time, but when things got hard, they vanished. You don't pretend, you don't hide what hurts. That's rare." "Clara, that's beautiful." Her eyes filled. "Though she tried to hide it, no one's ever called me beautiful for telling the truth." He smiled faintly. Then they didn't know what beauty was. It was that kind of love, not loud, not perfect, but true, that healed what the world had broken in both of them. Wyatt, who'd sworn never to trust again, found peace in her steady presence. Clara, who'd believed she was unworthy of kindness, found strength in his quiet faith one evening as the sky blazed orange and gold. Wyatt took her hand and led her toward the edge of the field behind the store. The grass swayed like waves, and the horizon seemed endless. "I used to think beauty was something you could see," he said, "watching the sunset. But it's not. It's what stays when everything else fades. The truth between two people when the lies are gone." Clara looked up at him, tears glinting in the fading light. "And what's our truth, Wyatt?" He smiled, soft and certain, that two broken souls can still make something. Hold that love don't need to be perfect, just real, for the first time. She didn't look away. She let herself believe him, and in that moment the scar on her face didn't matter, nor the past she carried. What mattered was that she was seen, not for what she wasn't, but for what she was. The wind rustled through the grass as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting them both in gold. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, just two people standing side by side, unafraid of being known. Clara smiled through her tears. "You're right. Wyatt, truth is beautiful." He squeezed her hand gently. "Always has been. Clara always will be." And as the last light faded into dusk, the world seemed to quiet around them. Two souls who had wandered through pain and found their way not to perfection, but to peace. For in the end, the beauty of truth was not in what could be seen, but in what could be trusted, and they had found both in each other.